A millionaire adopted a black child to improve his company's public image. During routine medical tests, doctors discovered the child shared a rare genetic marker with him, revealing that the boy was actually his grandson, born to the daughter he'd lost contact with years ago. His PR stunt became a family reunion. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Blackwood Mansion loomed, a Gothic testament to Arthur's wealth, its cold stone echoing the emptiness within. Leo, a boy of 10 with eyes that held the weight of unspoken stories, stood stiffly in the cavernous foyer. The air, thick with the scent of expensive polish and loneliness, seemed to suffocate him. Arthur, in his impeccably tailored suit, observed him from across the expanse, his expression unreadable. "Your room is upstairs," Arthur said, his voice a low, controlled rumble, devoid of warmth. Leo nodded, his small hand clutching a worn teddy bear. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock, a relentless counter to the stillness. Leo's apprehension was palpable. A small tremor in his hand betrayed his fear. Arthur, despite himself, felt a flicker of something akin to pity. He dismissed it immediately. This was a business transaction, a carefully calculated PR maneuver. Nothing more. The adoption was meant to improve his company's tarnished image, not to fill a void in his own heart. But the void was there, vast and echoing, mirroring the empty spaces in this opulent prison. The initial press coverage was a whirlwind. Headlines screamed, "Blackwood adopts." Photographs showed Arthur, stiff and formal, beside a hesitant Leo. The public's response was a cacophony of praise and suspicion. Arthur felt a gnawing unease, a subtle shift in his carefully constructed composure. He found himself observing Leo more closely. The boy's quiet demeanor, the way he traced patterns on his worn teddy bear, stirred something unexpected within Arthur, a flicker of empathy, quickly suppressed. One evening, while Leo slept, Arthur found himself drawn to the boy's room. The sterile, minimalist decor of the rest of the house was absent here. A single, colorful painting hung above the bed, a vibrant splash of color against the pale walls. Leo's few possessions spoke of a quiet life, carefully chosen toys, worn books with dog-eared pages, hinting at a story Arthur was only beginning to glimpse. The scent of baby powder lingered faintly in the air, a stark contrast to the austere fragrance of Arthur's own study. A wave of unfamiliar emotion, something akin to longing, washed over him. He sat by Leo's bed, the ticking of the grandfather clock a less insistent rhythm now, overshadowed by the soft rise and fall of the boy's breathing. He touched the boy's hair, a gesture both tentative and strangely tender. The contact sent a jolt through him, an unexpected connection that rattled the carefully constructed walls of his emotional fortress. He felt a sharp pang of guilt. This was not how he had planned this. The adoption was a deal, a strategic move. But as he looked at Leo, something profoundly unsettling shifted within him. He needed answers, and they were coming much sooner than he anticipated. The following morning, Leo's routine blood tests were scheduled. Arthur, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, found himself strangely anxious. He paced the sterile hallway of the clinic. The antiseptic sent a stark contrast to the faint scent of baby powder that still clung to his memory from the previous night. He watched Leo, small and quiet, sitting patiently in the waiting area, his gaze fixed on a brightly colored toy truck. A wave of protectiveness, unexpected and overwhelming, washed over Arthur. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since, well, never. The doctor's words hung in the air, sharp and precise, shattering Arthur's carefully constructed composure. A highly unusual genetic marker, Mr. Blackwood. One that, it's extremely rare. The doctor's hesitant tone spoke volumes. Arthur felt a cold dread creep into his heart, a premonition of something earth-shattering. The world tilted on its axis. Later, alone in his study, the weight of the doctor's words pressed down on him. He stared at a faded photograph of a younger Sarah, her rebellious spirit captured in a defiant smirk. Guilt, sharp and unforgiving, clawed at him. His daughter, cast aside, forgotten. The image of Leo, his grandson, merged with the memory of Sarah's face, the resemblance uncanny. He felt the icy grip of denial loosen its hold, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating truth. His carefully constructed life, his carefully controlled image was about to crumble. The polished mahogany of his desk felt cold and unforgiving under his trembling hand. He picked up the phone, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He had to find Sarah. He had to face his past. The enormity of what he had done and the possibility of what he could still do loomed large. His carefully built world was on the brink of collapse, and a terrifying, yet exhilarating, sense of freedom accompanied the fear. The sleek, black car glided through the rain-slicked streets, each drop a tiny percussion instrument on the glass roof. Inside, Arthur Blackwood, a man whose life was usually a meticulously orchestrated symphony of control, felt utterly adrift. The doctor's words echoed in his ears, a discordant note shattering the carefully constructed harmony of his existence. He glanced at the framed photo of a younger Sarah, her eyes mirroring the defiance that had once defined their relationship, now replaced by a haunting sadness. He hadn't seen her in 20 years. 20 years of silence, of self-imposed exile. The mansion loomed ahead, its imposing facade a cold, unwelcoming barrier. Inside, the silence was heavy, oppressive. Leo, usually so full of quiet energy, sat curled in a chair by the fireplace, a small, neglected toy truck lying beside him. He hadn't spoken much since the clinic, the usual bright spark in his eyes dimmed. Arthur watched him, a pang of guilt twisting in his chest. He had brought this boy into his sterile, impersonal world, a pawn in a game of public relations. Now the game had changed. "Leo," Arthur said, his voice rougher than he intended. The boy looked up, his eyes dark and questioning. "How was the doctor?" Leo shrugged, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay," he mumbled, his gaze dropping back to the truck. Arthur knelt beside him, a gesture so unfamiliar it felt awkward, clumsy. He reached out a hand, hesitant, then placed it gently on Leo's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch. "They ran some tests, sweetheart," Arthur said, his voice softer now, a tremor betraying the turmoil within him. "Some special tests." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Arthur's mind raced, searching for words to bridge the chasm between the man he was and the man he needed to become. He couldn't bear the weight of his deceit any longer. He had to find Sarah, confess, and face the consequences of his actions. The future, once a predictable, carefully planned landscape, now stretched before him, an uncharted wilderness full of both fear and a strange, burgeoning hope. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, a constant reminder of the storm raging inside him. The sterile calm of his mansion offered no solace. Only the looming shadow of his past and the fragile possibility of a future he couldn't even begin to imagine. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed, "Blackwood adopts, PR stunt or act of compassion." Arthur read them, a bitter taste coating his tongue. The articles were a cacophony of opinions, praise for his supposed benevolence, accusations of cynical manipulation. The public scrutiny felt like a physical weight. He found himself watching Leo more intently, noting the boy's quiet observations, the way he studied Arthur with those fathomless eyes. Leo, in his own silent way, seemed to sense the turmoil swirling around them. One evening, as the twilight painted long shadows across the polished floors of the mansion, Leo approached Arthur in the library, his small hand clutching a worn wooden toy soldier. "They say you adopted me for your company," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper, the words tinged with a sadness that chilled Arthur to the bone. The boy's directness was unsettling, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed facade Arthur had presented to the world. Arthur knelt, forcing himself to meet the boy's gaze. "There's more to it than that, Leo," he began, his voice catching. "Much more." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken truths and the weight of Arthur's carefully concealed past. The scent of old leather and aged paper hung in the air, a stark reminder of the years of calculated decisions and the cold, emotionless existence he'd cultivated. His guilt was a tangible thing, tightening its grip around his chest. He knew, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that he couldn't continue this charade. The truth, however painful, had to be faced. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, threatening to crush him beneath its burden. He had to find Sarah. He had to tell her everything. The following days were a blur of hushed phone calls and frantic internet searches. Arthur's opulent mansion, usually a sanctuary of sterile order, felt suffocating. The polished mahogany surfaces gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting his own haunted face. He felt the weight of his past, a crushing burden of regret and unanswered questions. Each click of the keyboard during his online searches echoed in the cavernous silence, a relentless reminder of his isolation. The scent of old books and leather, once comforting, now felt oppressive, mirroring the suffocating grip of his guilt. He found a faded photograph tucked away in a dusty box. Sarah, radiant at 18, her laughter captured in a candid shot. The image pierced him, a sharp stab of longing and self-reproach. He remembered her fierce spirit, her unwavering defiance, the way she'd looked at him, a mixture of love and simmering resentment. He'd pushed her away, driven by his ambition, his cold pursuit of success. The consequence, a lifetime of solitude, punctuated only by the hollow echoes of his own making. He finally located Sarah in a small coastal town, a world away from his gilded cage. The address was simple, a modest house nestled amongst others just like it. The quiet hum of the town's life, the distant sound of waves, the chirping of unseen birds, felt alien and strangely peaceful. He parked his sleek, expensive car, a stark contrast to its surroundings, feeling the tremor of fear in his stomach. This was it. He was about to confront a past he'd buried for years. He took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs, and stepped out into the quiet afternoon, his reflection disappearing into the gentle sway of the ocean breeze. He was about to ask for forgiveness, a word he'd never uttered before. The modest house felt smaller than it appeared from the street. Peeling paint, a slightly crooked porch, and a garden struggling valiantly against neglect. Arthur hesitated, the weight of years pressing down. He'd expected anger, rejection. He hadn't anticipated this quiet sadness. He rang the doorbell, the chime thin and reedy. A woman opened the door, her eyes mirroring the faded paint of the house, a weary, washed-out blue. Sarah. Years had etched lines around her eyes, but the defiant spark he remembered flickered faintly. She didn't smile. Arthur. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, laced with a chilling indifference. Sarah, he managed, his throat tight. The words felt inadequate, clumsy, like a poorly constructed bridge across a chasm of years. Silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant cry of gulls. He saw the tremor in her hand, the way her fingers clenched around the doorknob. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice devoid of warmth. The question hung in the air, stark and unforgiving. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. I need to talk to you. About Leo." The name, uttered aloud, felt both fragile and momentous. He stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of old furniture polish and something faintly floral, a desperate attempt at cheer. The living room was small, cluttered with well-worn books and photographs, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his own mansion. A single ray of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah gestured towards a worn armchair. "Sit." The command was terse, but there was a hint of weariness in her tone, a hint of something resembling resignation. He sat, the cheap fabric rough against his expensive suit. "There's something I need to tell you," Arthur began, his voice a low rumble, the words tumbling out haltingly. He told her about the genetic marker, about the doctor's suspicions, his own growing unease, his obsessive search for her. He spoke of the cold, calculated adoption that had inadvertently led him to this moment, a moment fraught with a mixture of dread and hope. He watched her face, searching for some indication of understanding, of forgiveness. The faintest glimmer of surprise flickered in her eyes as he spoke, a subtle shift in the wall she'd built around herself. The quiet hum of the town's life seemed to fade as their worlds collided in this small, dimly lit room. The weight of their shared past, the silent accusations, and the fragile hope for the future hung suspended between them. The story he had begun to tell was far from over. The silence stretched, heavy and thick with unspoken accusations. Sunlight, weak and watery, filtered through the dusty window, illuminating swirling motes in the air. The scent of old books and faded flowers clung to the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, antiseptic smell of Arthur's mansion. Sarah's silence was a wall, impenetrable and chilling. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a breath. "So, you're saying, Leo, he's my son?" Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a chipped teacup. Arthur watched, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He'd anticipated anger, rejection. This quiet, fragile despair was harder to bear. The doctor, the genetic marker, it's a long shot, but the probability, he stammered, the carefully rehearsed words failing him. He saw the tremor in her hand, the way her knuckles whitened as she gripped the cup. He felt the familiar icy grip of guilt tighten around his chest. "You used him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, more a statement than a question. The words hung in the air, sharp and accusing. He flinched, unable to meet her gaze. He'd expected a furious outburst, a torrent of rage. This quiet devastation was more potent, more painful. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "That wasn't my intention. I was desperate. My reputation." He stopped, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He couldn't explain the desperation that had driven him, the loneliness that had swallowed him whole. He couldn't justify his actions, only offer a plea for understanding. Sarah's eyes, the same weary blue he remembered, were filled with a profound sadness. "Desperate?" she repeated, the word hanging in the air like a bitter accusation. She set down the teacup, the delicate china clinking softly against the worn tabletop. The silence returned, heavier now, charged with unspoken years of pain, regret, and the fragile flicker of hope. The faintest glimmer of something like curiosity flickered in her eyes. A single tear traced a slow path down her cheek. Arthur, watching her, felt his own defenses begin to crumble. The carefully constructed wall of his own self-preservation started to show cracks. This wasn't about PR anymore. This was about a family, about a son he never knew, and a daughter he'd lost. The weight of it all threatened to suffocate him. But something else was there too. A nascent hope, fragile as a newborn's breath. The possibility of connection, of redemption. The sterile white of the doctor's office seemed to amplify the silence. Arthur sat rigidly, the crisp, starched fabric of his shirt a stark contrast to the tremor in his hands. Dr. Evans, a kind-faced woman with gentle eyes, placed the file on the desk, the paper rustling like dry leaves. "The genetic marker, Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice soft yet firm, "is exceptionally rare. The probability of a coincidental match is negligible." Arthur's breath hitched. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a premonition chilling him to the core. He'd expected a routine checkup for Leo, not this seismic shift in his meticulously constructed life. What does this mean?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the cavernous silence of the room. Dr. Evans hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It suggests a close biological relationship. A father-son relationship, perhaps, or even grandfather-grandson." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The faint scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the metallic tang of fear that flooded Arthur's senses. The drive back to the mansion was a blur. The usually imposing structure now felt oppressive, a gilded cage reflecting his internal turmoil. Leo's laughter, usually a jarring note in the quiet house, now seemed mockingly distant. He stopped abruptly, his large car jarring to a halt by the side of the road. The world seemed to spin around him. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The carefully crafted facade, the meticulously planned adoption, it all felt like a grotesque parody. His PR stunt, a desperate attempt to fill the gaping hole of loneliness in his life. A loneliness now magnified 1,000-fold by the shocking revelation. He buried his face in his hands, the leather cool against his burning cheeks. The truth was unbearable, the implications terrifying. Was this a twisted joke? A cruel twist of fate? Or was this redemption? The possibility hung in the air, both terrifying and strangely alluring. He'd built an empire on calculated risks. This was a risk of a different order entirely, one he couldn't afford to misjudge. The mansion's imposing silence pressed in on Arthur. He paced the library, the polished mahogany floor cold beneath his bare feet. The scent of old leather and dust did little to soothe the turmoil within. Leo's small, worn teddy bear lay abandoned on a plush armchair, a stark reminder of the boy's quiet apprehension. Arthur ran a hand through his graying hair, the movement jerky and uncontrolled. The doctor's words echoed in his ears. Grandfather, grandson. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to quell the fire in his gut. He swirled the glass, the ice clinking a discordant rhythm against the silence. He'd built his life on control, on calculated moves, yet this felt beyond his grasp. This was chaos, pure and unadulterated. He thought of Sarah, the rebellious daughter he'd cast aside, a ghost haunting the edges of his memory. Her face, once sharp and defiant, now blurred with the passage of time. Yet the pain of their fractured relationship remained, sharp and raw. He'd built walls around his heart, brick by agonizing brick, but now those walls threatened to crumble. The phone rang, the shrill sound jarring him from his reverie. He snatched it up, his voice tight. Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood. A crisp female voice answered. This is Ms. Davis from Genetic Solutions. We've completed the preliminary analysis of the samples. The probability of a familial relationship, it's exceptionally high. Arthur felt a cold sweat slick his palms. How high? He croaked, his voice barely audible. 99.9%, the voice confirmed, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. Arthur hung up, the phone slipping from his numb fingers. He sank into the leather armchair, the plush comfort offering no respite from the icy grip of dread. The teddy bear seemed to stare at him, a silent witness to his unraveling. He had to find Sarah. He had to face his past, not for his company's image, but for the sake of the boy whose laughter, once a discordant note, now echoed the hope of a future he never imagined. The cold, calculated millionaire was dissolving, replaced by a man drowning in the turbulent sea of his own making. The game had changed, and this time the stakes were infinitely higher. The news hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Arthur stared at the ornate ceiling of his study, the intricate carvings blurring through a film of disbelief. 99.9%. The figure repeated itself in his mind, a relentless mantra of impending doom and unexpected hope. He rubbed his temples, the sharp pressure a small comfort against the roaring chaos in his head. The phone vibrated again, a jarring interruption to his internal turmoil. It was his lawyer, his voice a smooth, practiced calm in stark contrast to Arthur's inner turmoil. Mr. Blackwood, I have the details regarding the adoption's media coverage. The positive response is significant, but there's also a significant undercurrent of skepticism. Skepticism. Arthur's voice was rough, barely a whisper. The lawyer's words were a minor distraction. The weight of the genetic test results crushed him. Let it be. It's irrelevant. He hung up, the abruptness reflecting the turmoil within. He walked to the window, the city lights a glittering, indifferent backdrop to his turmoil. He saw a lone figure below, a small boy kicking a soccer ball in the meticulously manicured gardens. Leo, the boy he'd adopted on a whim, a calculated move to bolster his tarnished reputation. Now, the boy was potentially his grandson. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm him. He gripped the window frame, his knuckles bone white. He'd always controlled every aspect of his life. This was a variable he couldn't calculate, an equation with too many unknowns. The fear, raw and primal, was unfamiliar territory. This wasn't about his public image anymore. It was about a blood tie, a connection he'd brutally severed years ago. His daughter, Sarah. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. He needed to find her. He had to, not for the sake of his reputation, but for the sake of the small boy playing in the garden, kicking a ball with a fierce, determined energy that mirrored the desperate hope blossoming in Arthur's own heart. The game had changed. He was no longer the player, but the pawn. And the game was about to begin. The sterile white of the doctor's office felt colder than usual. Arthur sat rigidly, the scent of antiseptic clinging to the air like a shroud. Dr. Albright's voice, usually soothing, held a cautious tremor. "Mr. Blackwood, the results of young Leo's genetic screening. They're unusual." Arthur's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He'd anticipated some minor anomaly, something easily explained. This was different. Unusual how? Arthur's voice was a dry rasp, the words catching in his throat. The doctor cleared his throat, shuffling papers. "We've identified a rare genetic marker. It's a match, a near-perfect match to your own DNA profile." The room seemed to tilt, the crisp white walls swaying slightly. Arthur felt a dizzying rush, the world narrowing to a pinpoint of blinding white. A near-perfect match? Impossible. Absurd. Yet, the chilling certainty of the doctor's words settled like a stone in his stomach. He'd built his life on calculated risks, on meticulously planned strategies. This was an uncontrollable variable, a chaos he couldn't calculate, couldn't contain. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. "Are you sure?" His voice was devoid of its usual controlled authority. It was raw, exposed, betraying a vulnerability he hadn't felt in years. Dr. Albright, a man of calm and measured demeanor, looked genuinely shaken. "The probability of this being a coincidence is infinitesimally small, Mr. Blackwood. We ran the tests twice." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Arthur stared out the window, the bustling city a blur of meaningless movement. The boy, Leo, his small, familiar form, flickered in his mind's eye. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the weight of the revelation too much to bear. His carefully constructed life, his controlled empire, was crumbling around him, revealing a raw, painful truth he'd buried deep within himself. A truth about a daughter he'd abandoned, a grandchild he'd unwittingly adopted, the calculated PR stunt, the cold, strategic adoption. It was all twisted into something far more profound, far more devastating and unexpectedly hopeful. The silence in the office was broken only by the frantic rhythm of his own pounding heart. His perfectly ordered world had been irrevocably altered. The game had changed, and he was no longer in control. The mahogany of Arthur's study felt cold beneath his palms. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun, slanting through the tall windows, illuminating the opulent but lifeless room. He sat, the doctor's words echoing in the cavernous silence. A near-perfect DNA match. His perfectly manicured life, built on steel and strategy, felt suddenly fragile, crumbling like ancient plaster. He swirled the amber liquid in his snifter, the rich scent of brandy doing little to soothe the turmoil within. A framed photograph on his desk caught his eye, Sarah. At 16, a vibrant whirlwind of rebellious energy, her dark hair a rebellious halo around her defiant face. The memory stung, a sharp jab of regret. He remembered her fierce spirit, her unwavering independence, the way she'd looked at him, a mixture of love and simmering resentment. He'd pushed her away, convinced his success demanded sacrifices. Now, the consequences of that decision loomed larger than any boardroom battle. He rose, pacing the plush Persian rug, its intricate pattern a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. He'd always prided himself on control, on meticulous planning. This was beyond his comprehension, a rogue variable that threatened to unravel everything. He pictured Leo, his small, quiet presence a stark contrast to the grandiose scale of his mansion. The boy's gentle eyes, his tentative smile images that now held a weight far heavier than their initial innocent appearance. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he punched in the number. It was a number he hadn't dialed in years, a number associated with a past he had meticulously tried to erase. The ringing tone felt like a hammer blow against the quiet of the study. Each ring was a step closer to a confrontation he both craved and dreaded. Finally, a hesitant voice answered. A woman's voice, tired yet tinged with a flicker of something else. Hope? Fear? He couldn't tell. He cleared his throat, his voice a low rumble. Sarah? It's Arthur. The silence on the other end was thick with unspoken emotions, a silent testament to years of estrangement and fractured dreams. The game had changed, he thought, his carefully constructed world shattering around him, the pieces falling into a pattern he'd never anticipated. A pattern that might lead him home. The line crackled with static before Sarah's voice, hesitant and brittle, answered. Arthur. The single word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations and years of silence. The scent of old paper and leather filled Arthur's study, a stark contrast to the sterile clinical smell that still clung to him from the doctor's office. He gripped the phone tighter, the smooth, cool plastic a small comfort against the tremor in his hand. Sarah, he began, his voice rougher than he'd anticipated. There's something I need to tell you, something about Leo. He could almost feel her apprehension, a tangible thing hanging between them across the miles of distance and years of bitterness. A long silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft hum of the phone. Arthur could picture her, her face etched with lines of worry and hardship. Her eyes, the same defiant dark eyes he remembered from her youth, narrowed in suspicion. The image sliced through his carefully constructed composure. He'd imagined this moment countless times, rehearsing the words, but nothing could prepare him for the raw vulnerability that flooded him now. He had some medical tests done, Arthur stammered, the words catching in his throat. There's a rare genetic marker, a marker that matches mine. He paused, bracing himself for her reaction. The silence stretched again, taut and unforgiving. Finally, Sarah's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. What are you saying, Arthur? The underlying tremor betrayed her carefully controlled composure. Fear, tinged with a flicker of something else, a fragile hope, colored her voice. The faintest scent of lavender, her favorite, seemed to drift across the miles, reaching him on the phone. It was a sensory memory, an unexpected phantom scent that tugged at his heart. He'd forgotten how much he loved that fragrance. I'm saying, Arthur said, his voice low and strained, that there's a possibility, a strong possibility, that Leo is your son. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Beat of his own heart. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming love. Leo, he's my son. Arthur felt a wave of relief wash over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. Years of guilt, of self-recrimination, seemed to melt away, replaced by a profound sense of redemption. He reached for her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both endured. The silence that followed was different now, filled not with tension, but with a shared sense of wonder, of the improbable miracle that had brought them together. The weight of his past actions still pressed down on him, heavy and undeniable, but it was now tempered by the burgeoning warmth of this newfound connection, a fragile family bond forged in the crucible of revelation. He saw the years melt away from Sarah's face, the hardness softening, replaced by the radiance of a mother reunited with her son. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but as he looked at Sarah, at the reflection of his own long-lost daughter in her tear-filled eyes, he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his soul, that they would face it together. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the vibrant bouquet of lilies Arthur had sent Sarah. He watched her, his heart a trapped bird fluttering against his ribs, as she reread the DNA results, her fingers tracing the confirming words. The small waiting room felt vast, the silence echoing the monumental shift in their lives. Sunlight slanted through the window, painting stripes across the worn carpet. Sarah looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but shining with a fragile hope. It's true," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent hallway. A single tear escaped, tracing a glistening path down her cheek. Arthur's throat tightened. He wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but fear held him back. Years of emotional distance had built an insurmountable wall between them. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unfamiliar. I didn't know," he began, his voice thick with regret. I should have been there. Should have." Sarah's voice was low, laced with a quiet bitterness that pierced through his carefully constructed defenses. "Should have been there for me, for him. You abandoned me, Arthur. You left me to face everything alone." Her gaze was unwavering, intense, reflecting years of unspoken pain and resentment. The lilies, vibrant symbols of reconciliation, seemed to wilt under the weight of her words. Arthur winced. He couldn't argue. Her words were a brutal, accurate reflection of his past actions. He felt the familiar icy grip of guilt constricting his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. He reached out a trembling hand, then hesitated, the gesture half-formed, half-hearted. Sarah's gaze softened slightly, though the hurt remained etched on her face. "He's a wonderful boy, Arthur," she said, her voice softer now, a hint of something akin to forgiveness threading through the pain. "He deserves a grandfather, even if you were late arriving." The unspoken understanding hung heavy in the air. The DNA report was more than just a piece of paper. It was a bridge, albeit a fragile one, spanning the chasm of their fractured relationship. The road ahead remained long and arduous, filled with the debris of the past. But the first step, hesitant and uncertain as it was, had been taken. The shared look between them, a tentative promise of reconciliation, finally broke the oppressive silence, offering a glimmer of hope in the sterile, white waiting room. The sterile white of the hospital hallway seemed to amplify the tremor in Arthur's hand as he followed Sarah. The scent of antiseptic battled with the faint, sweet perfume she wore, a stark reminder of the years that separated them, the chasm of his making. He'd expected anger, resentment. He hadn't anticipated the quiet fragility in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of unspoken grief. They reached her small apartment, a haven of worn comfort in stark contrast to Arthur's opulent mansion. Sunlight streamed through the lace-curtained window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. A child's drawing, crude but vibrant, adorned the fridge. "Leo." Silence hung heavy between them as Sarah poured 2 mugs of tea, the clinking of porcelain oddly loud in the quiet space. Arthur watched her hands, noticing the faint calluses, the slight tremor as she placed the mugs on the worn table. He wanted to reach out, to offer solace, but the memory of his past actions, his callous indifference, stilled his hand. He's just like you, Arthur," Sarah finally said, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the swirling tea in her mug, the same stubborn chin, the same intensity in his eyes. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't noticed before, hadn't dared to look closely. He'd been blinded by his own self-interest, his need for a PR win. Now, the resemblance struck him with the force of a physical blow. The boy he'd adopted for the sake of his reputation was his grandson. I never meant to hurt you, Sarah," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. The words felt inadequate, hollow, against the backdrop of his past actions. Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of pain and hesitant hope. "Actions speak louder than words, Arthur," she said softly, her gaze intense. "Your actions spoke volumes." He knew she was right. He'd tried to buy his way out of his past, to erase the mistakes he'd made. He hadn't expected a simple blood test to undo years of calculated detachment. Now, faced with the tangible evidence of his familial ties, he knew that true reconciliation wouldn't come easily. It demanded more than money. It required genuine contrition, genuine change. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he'd carried in his life. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur Blackwood felt a flicker of hope, a fragile seed of possibility blossoming in the barren landscape of his heart. The antiseptic scent of the clinic faded as they stepped into Sarah's small apartment, a haven of quiet comfort. Sunlight, filtered through lace curtains, illuminated dust motes dancing in the golden rays. A child's drawing, a vibrant explosion of color on a refrigerator, caught Arthur's eye. It was Leo, a small, lopsided figure with a determined grin. Silence settled, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Sarah poured tea, the clinking porcelain sharp in the stillness. Arthur watched her hands, calloused and delicate, the tremor still present as she set down the mugs. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat, choked by years of silence and regret. Sarah's eyes, reflecting the light, held a mixture of pain and guarded hope. He's your image, Arthur," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock. That stubborn chin, the intensity in his eyes, "It's you." The words hit him like a physical blow. The resemblance, so striking, now undeniable, was a painful revelation. He'd been blind, focused only on the strategic advantage, the public image. Now he saw Leo not as a PR pawn, but as a reflection of his own blood, his own history. I never meant to hurt you, Sarah," he finally managed, his voice rough with unshed tears. The words sounded hollow, inadequate against the mountain of his past failings. Sarah's gaze intensified, her pain evident, but a flicker of something else, something akin to forgiveness, shone through. "Actions speak louder than words, Arthur," she responded, her voice soft but resolute. "And yours spoke volumes." He knew she was right. He'd built walls around his heart, erected barriers of wealth and power to protect himself from the pain. He'd tried to buy his way out of his mistakes, to erase his past. The DNA test results, clutched in his hand, felt heavy, a weight far greater than any financial burden. This wasn't about money. It was about the immeasurable value of family. The truth, brutal and undeniable, hung between them. He had a long road ahead, a path of amends and reconciliation. Yet, in the quiet intimacy of Sarah's apartment, under the watchful gaze of Leo's vibrant drawing, a fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the desolate landscape of Arthur's heart. The waiting room seemed miles away. The weeks that followed were a fragile dance of tentative steps and unspoken apologies. Sarah's small apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a battlefield of simmering resentments. The air, thick with the scent of old books and brewing coffee, crackled with unspoken words. Arthur, used to commanding boardrooms, felt utterly out of his depth, his usual decisiveness replaced by a crippling uncertainty. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside, Arthur found Sarah in the kitchen, meticulously peeling potatoes. The rhythmic scrape of the peeler was a counterpoint to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. He watched her, a mixture of guilt and admiration swirling within him. "Sarah," he began, his voice a hesitant whisper. The words felt clumsy, inadequate to express the weight of his regret. She didn't look up, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. "Yes, Arthur. I want to help. Financially, to ensure Leo has everything he needs." He watched her carefully, bracing himself for her reaction. Sarah finally looked up, her eyes filled with a weary sadness. "Money won't erase the past, Arthur. It won't replace the years you weren't there." Her voice was low, but her words carried the sting of years of hurt. He nodded, understanding her pain. "I know, and I don't expect it to." But I want to show Leo, that I'm here now, that I want to be a part of your lives. He paused, searching for the right words. I failed you both terribly, and I'm trying to make amends. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle hiss of the kettle. Then, Sarah sighed, a slow, weary sound. It's a start, Arthur, but it's a very long road ahead. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air: trust, forgiveness, the possibility of a future. The faint scent of lavender from a nearby candle seemed to soften the harsh reality of their situation. A whisper of hope in the face of years of hurt. He had a lot to prove, he knew, but for the first time in a long time, the prospect didn't fill him with dread, but with a cautious, hopeful anticipation. The following weeks were a blur of awkward silences and tentative gestures. Arthur, accustomed to the polished surfaces of his mansion, found himself overwhelmed by the lived-in chaos of Sarah's small apartment. The scent of old books and simmering coffee clung to the air, a stark contrast to the sterile cleanliness he was used to. He saw the strain etched on Sarah's face, the weary slump of her shoulders a testament to years of struggle. He watched her interact with Leo, a hesitant tenderness in her touch that mirrored his own burgeoning feelings. One evening, while Leo was engrossed in a drawing, Arthur found Sarah in the kitchen, humming softly as she kneaded dough. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet space. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough with emotion. He felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him, a heavy cloak of guilt. About Leo, about his schooling. Sarah looked up, her eyes guarded. "He's doing well. He's happy." Her voice was tight, her words carefully chosen. "I want to ensure he has the best opportunities. The best schools, the best everything." Arthur struggled to find the right words, his usual eloquence failing him. Sarah's gaze softened slightly. "He's happy here, Arthur. With me." The unspoken words hung between them. "Don't take him away again." Arthur understood. He nodded slowly, the weight of his past missteps heavy on his chest. He reached for a nearby chair. The worn would cool beneath his touch. "I know," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper, "but I want to be a part of his life. A good part." He saw a flicker of something, hope, in her eyes. It was a tiny spark, but it was there. The scent of baking bread filled the air, a comforting aroma in the face of their uncertain future. The rhythmic thud of the dough offered a quiet cadence to their unspoken conversation, a rhythm of reconciliation. He had a long way to go to earn her trust, to mend the shattered pieces of their relationship, but tonight, in the warm glow of the afternoon sun and the comforting scent of baking bread, a fragile bridge had been built. The following weeks were a delicate dance of hesitant steps and unspoken apologies. Arthur, used to barking orders and commanding attention, found himself strangely tongue-tied in Sarah's small, sun-drenched apartment. The air hummed with a quiet tension, punctuated by the clinking of mugs and the soft rustle of Leo's drawings. He watched Sarah, her movements graceful despite the weariness etched into her face, a perpetual shadow of worry lurking beneath her eyes. One evening, finding her alone amidst a pile of neatly stacked laundry, Arthur cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the stillness. "Sarah," he began, the word catching in his throat. "About Leo's future, I want to help." Sarah didn't look up, her fingers meticulously folding a tiny shirt. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken resentments and years of hurt. The scent of lavender from the detergent hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, expensive scents of his mansion. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "He's happy here, Arthur. Don't disrupt that." Arthur winced inwardly. He understood her fear, her reluctance to trust him again. He saw the flicker of apprehension in her eyes, the ghost of a past trauma refusing to be silenced. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, then retracting as quickly as it came. "I understand," he murmured, his voice hoarse, "but I want to be a part of his life, to make amends." He saw a subtle shift in her posture, a slight softening of her rigid stance. The silence lingered, but it felt different now, lighter somehow. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his fingers against the armrest of the worn chair filled the quiet space, a tentative overture of peace. He spoke again, this time with a carefully chosen phrase, a bridge of words to cross the chasm between them. "I'm not asking for forgiveness yet, but I want to try." The faint scent of old books, familiar and comforting, seemed to carry his quiet plea. The faintest of smiles touched Sarah's lips, a tiny crack in the wall of her defenses. It was a beginning. The following weeks were a slow, painstaking process of rebuilding trust. Sarah's apartment, small and filled with the scent of laundry detergent and old books, felt a world away from Arthur's sterile mansion. He learned to navigate the cramped space, his large frame awkwardly adjusting to the cozy confines. He brought flowers, lilies, her favorite, a small gesture that spoke volumes after years of silence. Sarah accepted them, her touch hesitant, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of gratitude. One afternoon, Arthur found Leo meticulously drawing in his small notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. The child, usually withdrawn, was surprisingly relaxed in his mother's presence. Arthur watched from the doorway, mesmerized by the boy's quiet intensity. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light, a scene surprisingly peaceful after the storm of their revelations. "He's good," Arthur finally said, his voice a low rumble. Sarah looked up, a question in her eyes. "He's always been creative," she replied softly, a hint of pride in her voice. "He doesn't talk much, but he expresses himself this way." Arthur nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw Leo's talent not as a mere hobby, but as a window into his soul, a testament to his resilience. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It held a comfortable intimacy, a shared understanding that transcended words. Later, over tea, Arthur attempted a tentative apology. I'm sorry, Sarah," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. "For everything." Sarah looked at him, her gaze intense, filled with both pain and a glimmer of something else, perhaps forgiveness. "It's a start, Arthur," she said, her voice low and trembling. "But it's going to take more than words." He knew she was right. The path to reconciliation was long and arduous, but the tentative steps they were taking, the shared silences filled with unspoken emotions, were a testament to the possibility of healing. The lavender scent, once a symbol of the distance between them, now felt like a fragile bridge, connecting past regrets to a hopeful future. The rhythmic ticking of a nearby clock marked the passage of time, the steady beat a comforting counterpoint to the emotional undercurrents swirling between them. The simple act of sharing tea in a small apartment was the beginning of a new chapter, a hesitant but hopeful dance toward a future where forgiveness and family were possible. The following weeks were a blur of tentative steps and hesitant smiles. Arthur, accustomed to the stark lines of his minimalist mansion, found himself captivated by the chaotic warmth of Sarah's small apartment. The scent of lavender, once a symbol of their estrangement, a scent he'd associated with Sarah's rebellious youth, now felt comforting, a familiar anchor in the unfamiliar landscape of their rekindled relationship. Leo, initially wary, began to loosen around his grandfather. He'd often sit quietly in the corner, sketching in his worn notebook, the rhythmic scratching of his pencil a soothing counterpoint to the quiet hum of conversation between Arthur and Sarah. One evening, Arthur found Leo sketching a portrait of him. It wasn't a flattering likeness. The lines were harsh, capturing the sharp angles of his jaw and the weariness etched around his eyes. But there was something in the child's intense focus, a raw honesty in his depiction that moved Arthur deeply. "He's very observant," Sarah said, her voice soft, a hint of pride lacing her words as she watched her son. Arthur looked at the drawing, then at Leo. The boy looked up, their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, a connection sparked, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience. A bond forged not through words but through shared glances and unspoken understanding. The raw emotion in Leo's eyes mirrored Arthur's own unspoken regrets. Later, Arthur found Sarah in the kitchen, carefully folding laundry. The gentle rhythm of her movements felt strangely comforting in the quiet apartment. He watched her for a long moment, the years of distance melting away, replaced by a growing understanding. He wanted to apologize again, to undo the years of silence and hurt, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. "He's a good boy, Sarah," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "He's resilient," she whispered, "just like his mother." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Arthur sat down beside her, the worn wooden chair creaking softly under his weight. He reached out hesitantly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose, and gently took her hand. Her skin was soft, her touch hesitant, yet it felt like a lifeline. The silence between them was charged with unspoken emotion, a silent testament to the journey they had undertaken, a journey fraught with pain, but promising a future filled with the possibility of healing and forgiveness. The lavender scent, once a symbol of their separation, now hung in the air, a gentle fragrance of hope. The following weeks were a delicate dance of tentative steps and hesitant smiles. Arthur, used to the sterile perfection of his mansion, found himself strangely comforted by the chaotic warmth of Sarah's small apartment. The scent of lavender, once a symbol of their fractured past, now held a poignant familiarity, a gentle anchor in this uncharted territory of reconciliation. He watched Leo, his grandson, sketching in his worn notebook, the rhythmic scratch of pencil a soothing counterpoint to their hushed conversations. One evening, Arthur found Leo sketching a portrait of him. It wasn't flattering, harsh lines captured the sharp angles of his jaw, the weariness etched around his eyes. Yet, there was an intense focus, a raw honesty in the depiction that struck a chord within him. "He's very observant," Sarah murmured, a hint of pride in her voice. Arthur glanced from the drawing to Leo. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience, a bond forming not through words, but unspoken understanding. The raw emotion in Leo's eyes mirrored Arthur's own unspoken regrets. Later, Arthur found Sarah in the kitchen, the gentle rhythm of her folding laundry strangely soothing. He watched her, the years of distance melting away, replaced by a growing understanding. He longed to apologize, to undo the past, but the words caught in his throat. "He's a good boy, Sarah," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah looked up, her eyes a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "He's resilient," she whispered, "just like his mother." A small smile touched her lips. Arthur sat beside her, the worn wooden chair creaking softly. He reached for her hand, hesitantly at first, then with growing purpose. Her touch was hesitant, yet it felt like a lifeline, a connection forged in the crucible of their shared past. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotion, a testament to their journey, a journey of pain, but one promising healing and forgiveness. The lavender scent, once a symbol of their separation, now hung in the air, a fragrance of fragile hope. The weight of his past actions pressed heavily on Arthur, but amidst the quiet understanding, a tentative optimism blossomed. The morning sun, a pale wash of gold, filtered through the lace curtains of Sarah's small apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Leo, nestled on the worn sofa, hummed a tuneless melody, his fingers tracing the worn cover of a dog-eared book. The quiet intensity of his focus mirrored the fragile peace settling between Arthur and Sarah. He was a constant reminder of the delicate balance they were striving to achieve. Arthur watched them both, a wave of unfamiliar warmth washing over him. The sterile, clinical environment of his mansion felt a lifetime away. Here, amidst the gentle chaos of everyday life, he felt a sense of belonging he'd never known. He saw the faint lines of worry etched around Sarah's eyes, the subtle way she shifted her weight, always subtly watchful. "He's growing so fast," Sarah said softly, breaking the quiet. Her voice, though low, held a tremor of emotion. Arthur nodded, his throat tightening. He wanted to say so much, to pour out years of regret and unspoken apologies. But the words remained trapped, tangled in a web of guilt and uncertainty. He had a lot to make up for, to fix the damage he'd caused. He could see the wariness in her eyes, the reluctance to fully trust him again. "He reminds me of you," she added, her gaze drifting to Leo. A faint smile touched her lips, a ghost of a smile that betrayed the lingering sadness. The simple statement resonated deeply. Arthur saw the resemblance, too, in Leo's thoughtful eyes, in the stubborn set of his jaw. It was a chilling reminder of his own past mistakes, his own selfish choices that had led to this estranged reconciliation. He wanted to prove he'd changed, to earn this fragile, precious peace, to show Sarah, to show Leo, the man he was now striving to become. This wouldn't be a quick fix, but a slow, tentative rebuilding of a broken bridge. He cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet room. I want to help," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to help you both." Sarah looked up, her eyes searching his. Hope flickered in their depths, but fear still lurked, a dark shadow clinging to the edges of her expression. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with years of silent accusations, with the weight of a fractured past and the fragile hope of a new beginning. The journey was far from over. Yet, in that quiet apartment, bathed in the gentle light of the morning sun, a seed of reconciliation had been planted, nurtured by the quiet understanding between three hearts that had found their way back to each other. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, rich and dark, hung in the air of Arthur's redesigned study. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Gone were the cold, sterile surfaces of his former life. In their place, warm wood paneling, comfortable armchairs, and a child's drawing pinned to the corkboard, a vibrant crayon sketch of Leo, himself, and Sarah, a lopsided smile adorning Leo's face. Leo, perched on a stool beside Arthur's desk, meticulously assembled a complex model airplane, his brow furrowed in concentration. The quiet intensity of his focus tugged at Arthur's heart. He watched Leo, his grandson, a boy he'd initially viewed as a mere pawn, now a cherished source of unexpected joy. A soft knock echoed, and Sarah entered, her eyes mirroring the hesitant hope that had become a constant in their tentative family dynamic. She carried a tray laden with steaming mugs and a plate of freshly baked cookies, the scent of cinnamon warm and inviting. "He's been at it for hours," Sarah said softly, her voice laced with a gentle amusement that warmed Arthur from the inside out. "He's incredibly meticulous, just like someone I know." Her gaze flickered towards Arthur, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Arthur chuckled, a sound unfamiliar and slightly awkward, yet undeniably genuine. "I suppose the apple doesn't fall far from the tree," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. The years of estrangement, the wall of bitterness he'd erected, felt impossibly distant now. Leo, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, looked up from his airplane, his large, expressive eyes reflecting the growing warmth between his mother and grandfather. He offered a shy smile, a small gesture that spoke volumes. In that moment, surrounded by the gentle chaos of everyday life, Arthur felt a profound shift. The weight of his past mistakes still lingered, but it no longer crushed him, fueled him. He would continue to earn their trust, to build a foundation of love and forgiveness, brick by painstaking brick. This newfound family, this fragile peace, was worth fighting for. The sterile coldness of his former life felt as distant and unreal as a faded photograph. He had found something far more precious than wealth or reputation. He had found a family. The renovated kitchen, once a sterile expanse of stainless steel, now hummed with a comforting domesticity. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. The scent of cinnamon and baking bread mingled with the faint aroma of coffee, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Sarah hummed a soft tune as she carefully iced a batch of cupcakes. Leo perched on a stool beside her, meticulously decorating his own with rainbow sprinkles. Arthur watched them from the doorway, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The The sight filled him with a quiet joy, a stark contrast to the icy loneliness that had once defined his life. He'd spent weeks, months even, meticulously trying to undo the damage of years of neglect, of pushing away the very things that could have brought him happiness. "They're beautiful," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, a little rusty from disuse. Sarah looked up, a hesitant smile gracing her lips. "Leo insisted on helping," she replied, her gaze softening as she watched her son's focused concentration. The tension that had once permeated their interactions was slowly, tentatively, dissolving. Leo, oblivious to the unspoken emotions swirling between his mother and grandfather, grinned proudly, showcasing his cupcake masterpiece. "Look, Grandpa, a rainbow explosion," Arthur chuckled, the sound genuine and heartfelt this time. He knelt beside Leo, his touch gentle as he examined the colorful creation. "It's magnificent, Leo, a truly magnificent rainbow explosion." He felt a lump forming in his throat, the weight of his past actions still pressing down, but lighter now, less suffocating. He was learning to live with it, to use it as fuel to build something real, something lasting. He would prove to Sarah, to Leo, that his change was genuine, that he was worthy of their trust. The process was slow, arduous, but the rewards were immeasurable. The warmth in this kitchen, the scent of baking bread, the sound of Leo's laughter, these were the things that were slowly but surely thawing the frozen heart of Arthur Blackwood. The following weeks were a blur of therapists' appointments, awkward family dinners, and stilted conversations punctuated by long silences. Sarah, still wary, kept her distance, a fragile shield of resentment protecting her heart. Leo, however, was an unyielding beacon of innocent affection. He'd taken to calling Arthur Grandpa, a word that resonated with a poignant sweetness, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed facade Arthur had maintained for so long. One evening, Arthur found Leo sketching in his room, a surprisingly detailed drawing of the mansion's sprawling gardens. The boy's brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue poking out from the corner of his mouth. The scene, bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, held a tender intimacy. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound hesitant. Leo looked up, startled, a flicker of apprehension crossing his usually bright eyes. "It's beautiful," Arthur murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't want to frighten him, to shatter this unexpected intimacy. Leo, ever perceptive, sensed no threat. He offered the drawing to Arthur with a shy smile. "I drew the rose garden," he said softly, his fingers tracing the delicate lines of his work. "It smells nice there." Arthur's fingers brushed against the paper, tracing the outline of a blooming rose. A wave of emotion washed over him, guilt, remorse, and the burgeoning hope of genuine connection. He'd never truly appreciated the simple beauty of things, let alone the innocence of a child's perspective. "It is beautiful," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. He sat beside Leo, the silence comfortable, shared, not empty. He felt a connection forming, a bond slowly replacing the years of neglect. This wasn't a PR stunt. This was real. This was family. The realization was a profound and unexpectedly comforting revelation. His heart, long encased in ice, felt a crack, a tiny fissure of warmth spreading through its cold chambers. He looked at Leo, at the boy's innocent trust, and knew he had to prove himself worthy of it. This was just the beginning of a long journey, a difficult road to redemption, but one he was finally, fully ready to walk. The crisp autumn air nipped at Arthur's cheeks as he walked through the park with Leo. Sunlight, filtered through the turning leaves, dappled the path. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air. Leo, bundled in a bright red jacket, skipped ahead, chasing fallen leaves. Arthur watched, a faint smile playing on his lips. This simple scene, a common occurrence for most families, felt monumental to him. He'd never shared such moments before. He'd always been too busy, too focused on the next deal, the next acquisition. Now he savored the quiet joy. Later, in the warm glow of his remodeled study, Arthur sat with Sarah, a steaming mug of tea warming his hands. The room, once sterile and impersonal, now held family photographs, carefully selected mementos that seemed to breathe life into the space. I want to make things right," Arthur began, his voice hesitant, a stark contrast to his usual commanding tone. Sarah looked at him, her gaze guarded but softened by a flicker of hope. "The money, it's not just for Leo, it's for you too, to help you start over, to give you the life you deserve." Sarah's eyes welled up. "I never wanted your money, Arthur," she said, her voice trembling. "I wanted you." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with years of unspoken pain and regret. The unspoken accusations, the missed opportunities, the chasm between them. All of it felt palpable in the silence that followed. Arthur reached across the small table separating them, his hand hovering over hers. This time he didn't pull away. He let his hand rest gently on hers, feeling the warmth of her skin. "I know," he whispered, his voice catching, "and I understand if you can't forgive me." The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of guilt. But beneath it, a fragile seed of hope began to sprout. He was ready to atone. He was ready to fight for this fragile family. He'd always had the power to change things, but only now did he have the willingness. The renovated wing of Arthur's mansion hummed with a quiet domesticity. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah, perched on a plush armchair, nervously fingered a chipped mug. The scent of freshly baked bread, a stark contrast to the usual sterile aroma of Arthur's home, filled the air. Leo, sprawled on the floor, meticulously arranged toy cars, his brow furrowed in concentration. Arthur, watching them both, felt a pang of something akin to contentment. "He's different," Sarah murmured, her gaze fixed on Leo. The worry etched onto her face softened slightly as she watched him play. Arthur nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Yes," he agreed, his voice raspy. "He's happy." The word felt foreign, almost awkward on his tongue, and used to expressing such simple emotions. He had always equated happiness with acquisition, with success, with power. This quiet joy, this gentle contentment, this was something entirely new. He watched Sarah carefully. The guardedness remained in her eyes, a legacy of their fractured past. Yet there was a softness to her expression he hadn't seen in decades. The resentment hadn't entirely vanished, but it had begun to crack, revealing a glimpse of the woman he had hurt so deeply. He rose, walking towards her, the polished wood floor creaking softly under his weight. He placed a hand on her arm, a gesture hesitant yet sincere. The touch sparked a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to build a future. For all of us." He paused, watching her face for any sign of rejection. The silence stretched, punctuated only by Leo's quiet humming. The weight of his past actions felt suffocating, a heavy cloak he couldn't fully shed, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, fragile yet persistent. He had given Leo a home. Now, he had to give Sarah something far more precious. His unwavering commitment, his enduring love, and an unyielding promise of a brighter future. The financial support was merely the beginning. The true work had just begun. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than usual. Arthur, usually so composed, fidgeted with a pen. The polished would cool against his sweating palm. News of Leo's parentage had leaked. A whisper campaign, cleverly orchestrated, was spreading through financial circles, painting him as a heartless manipulator who'd cynically exploited a child for personal gain. His rival, Julian Thorne, a man whose ambition was as sharp as a shard of glass, was undoubtedly behind it. "They're saying it's all a PR stunt," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes filled with a fear that mirrored his own. The air hung heavy with unspoken anxieties. The scent of expensive coffee, usually a comfort, now felt acrid, mirroring the bitterness of the situation. Arthur looked at Sarah, her face etched with worry lines that seemed to deepen with every passing moment. "Leo," oblivious to the storm brewing around him, sat quietly, drawing with crayons, his small hands surprisingly steady. The vibrant colors of his drawing stood in stark contrast to the bleak atmosphere. "They'll believe what they want to believe," Arthur said, his voice rough. He pushed away the pen, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a heavy burden he'd carried for years. He tried to buy his way into redemption, but now it seemed the price might be far higher than he'd anticipated. The tension in the room was a physical thing, thick enough to cut with a knife. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic scratching of Leo's crayon. Arthur felt a surge of protective anger, a fierce need to shield Leo and Sarah from the ugliness of the situation. He had to fight back, not just for his company, but for his family, a family he'd fought so hard to claim, and now fought even harder to protect. He rose, his resolve hardening. The fight had begun. The muted hum of the city outside was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Arthur's opulent study. Sunlight, filtered through the heavy drapes, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden rays. He sat at his massive mahogany desk, the polished surface reflecting his grim face. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort now tainted by anxiety. Sarah sat opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her usual vibrant energy was muted, replaced by a fragile stillness. The faint scent of lavender from her perfume, usually a calming presence, felt thin and fragile, mirroring her emotional state. Leo, nestled on a plush rug by the fireplace, built a tower of blocks, his small face concentrated, oblivious to the adult tension. The quiet click of the blocks against each other punctuated the silence. "They're digging," Arthur finally said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to a newspaper article on his desk, its headline screaming accusations of deception and exploitation. The sharp black print seemed to mock him. Sarah's breath hitched. "I knew this would happen. I told you." Her voice, though soft, held an edge of accusation. "This whole thing, it was never really about Leo, was it?" Arthur flinched. He looked at Leo, his grandson, building his tower with quiet intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. The image struck him with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. He'd never seen such focus in a child. It was a stark contrast to the cold, calculated image of himself he'd meticulously constructed. This wasn't a PR stunt anymore. This was his family. "It started as that," Arthur admitted, his voice thick with remorse. "But it's become something more. I didn't expect this connection." He felt the sting of tears welling in his eyes, a sensation utterly foreign and unsettling. A silence descended, heavy with unspoken words and years of regret. The crackling fire in the hearth seemed to intensify, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Sarah looked at Leo, her expression softening as she watched him. "He's happy," she whispered, her voice catching. "He's got a good heart, just like his father." The mention of Leo's father brought a renewed wave of guilt to Arthur. He'd never known the man, nor had he made any effort to find him, choosing instead to hide behind his wealth and power. Arthur rose and walked to the fireplace, staring into the dancing flames. "I'm going to fight this," he said, his voice firm, though a tremor still ran through it. "For Leo, for you, for us." He felt Sarah's gaze on him, a mixture of hope and apprehension in her eyes. The fight wouldn't be easy. The stakes were high, far higher than any business deal. This was a battle for his family, for redemption, for a future he'd almost destroyed. The fight had truly begun. The scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the lingering scent of fear that clung to Sarah. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Arthur, usually a picture of controlled precision, moved with an almost hesitant grace, pouring coffee with a tremor in his hand. He'd spent the last few days attempting to be a normal grandfather, reading Leo bedtime stories, clumsy attempts at playful wrestling that left both of them breathless with laughter. He's different, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on Leo, who was happily engrossed in building a tower of brightly colored blocks. He's so much like Mark. The mention of Leo's father brought a fresh wave of pain, a familiar ache in her chest. Arthur watched Leo, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He hadn't expected this overwhelming tide of affection, this fierce protectiveness he felt towards this small boy. He'd initially adopted Leo for his company's image, yet now, the thought of losing him felt like a physical blow. "I know," Arthur replied, his voice husky. "He's special." He took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness a stark reminder of the bitterness he'd carried for so long. "I've been a fool." Sarah finally looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and cautious hope. "We all make mistakes, Arthur. The important thing is, are you willing to make amends?" He met her gaze, his own filled with a newfound determination. "I'm fighting for this," he said, his voice firm. He gestured towards Leo. "For him, for us." The newspaper article, the looming threat of a scandal, suddenly felt less significant. This fragile, nascent family was worth fighting for. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, a warmth spreading through the chill of his past mistakes. He reached across the table, his hand covering Sarah's, a silent promise hanging between them, as strong and enduring as the love he was discovering for his grandson. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than usual. Arthur, usually a master of controlled composure, felt the chill seep into his bones. Across the polished table, Mr. Davies, CEO of rival firm Apex Industries, leaned back, a predatory smile playing on his lips. The scent of expensive leather and impending doom hung heavy in the air. A heartwarming tale, Blackwood, Davies purred, his voice dripping with insincerity. The prodigal grandfather, the adopted grandson. A brilliant PR move, wouldn't you say? He chuckled, the sound grating on Arthur's nerves. Arthur's knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair. The carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for decades threatened to crumble. Davies' words, though laced with venom, weren't entirely untrue. He'd initially adopted Leo for the publicity. But the truth, the raw, messy truth, was far more complex. "My intentions were misconstrued," Arthur began, his voice low and controlled, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. He pushed a file across the table, containing irrefutable proof of Leo's parentage. "The DNA evidence speaks for itself." Davies scoffed. "Evidence selectively released? I doubt your sudden philanthropic gesture is purely coincidental. Apex will be launching a full investigation." The threat hung unspoken, but palpable. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. The fragile peace he'd built with Sarah and Leo felt suddenly threatened. He could almost feel Sarah's anxious gaze, Leo's trusting eyes, and the weight of their happiness on his shoulders. He met Davies' gaze, a steely resolve hardening his features. "Investigate. I have nothing to hide. The truth, Mr. Davies, is far more compelling than any carefully crafted narrative." He rose, his movements deliberate, confident. "And it's a truth I intend to share with the world." He picked up his briefcase, the leather cool against his fingertips, leaving Davies to his simmering rage and the unsettling silence of the boardroom. The air, once thick with tension, now felt lighter, a small victory in a much larger battle. The fight for his family had just begun. The warmth of the kitchen, usually a sterile expanse of stainless steel and granite, felt different now. The scent of Sarah's apple pie, a homely counterpoint to the mansion's opulent grandeur, hung in the air. Leo, perched on a stool, watched Arthur carefully peel an apple, his small hands mimicking the movements. A hesitant smile played on his lips. "Grandpa," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. The word, so simple yet profound, resonated deeply. He'd spent a lifetime building walls, yet here, in this humble kitchen, they were crumbling. "Yes, Leo?" he replied, his voice softer than he'd intended. It smells nice, Leo said, his eyes fixed on the golden brown pie cooling on the wire rack. Like Grandma's. The unspoken understanding hung between them, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile family unit they were building. Sarah entered, her face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope. The apprehension in her eyes was palpable, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from her smile. He's been asking about your baking all afternoon, Sarah said, her voice laced with affection. He remembers you from before. Arthur met Sarah's gaze, a silent conversation passing between them. The past loomed, a shadow they both struggled to outrun. The unspoken accusations, the years of estrangement, weighed heavily on their present. Yet, in the comforting aroma of the pie and the quiet contentment of his grandson, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't known he craved: peace. He placed the peeled apple beside Leo, offering a rare, genuine smile. It's good to be here, Arthur admitted, his voice husky with emotion. The words were a small step, a tentative bridge across the chasm of their fractured history. The fight for his family was ongoing. A battle fought not in boardrooms, but in the quiet intimacy of a kitchen, warmed by the scent of apple pie and the promise of a future they were slowly building together. The following weeks were a blur of awkward silences and hesitant smiles. The grand mansion, once a symbol of Arthur's solitary power, now echoed with the tentative sounds of a family forming. Leo, initially shy, began to blossom under Sarah's gentle care. He'd often be found nestled beside her, his small hand gripping hers as they watched cartoons. The sight filled Arthur with a bittersweet ache, a longing for the years he'd missed. One evening, during a family dinner, a jarring contrast to Arthur's usual solitary meals, a tense silence fell. Sarah, her eyes fixed on her untouched plate, spoke softly. "Arthur," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know if I can trust this. Feels too good to be true." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Arthur reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers before gently covering it. The warmth of his touch surprised them both. "I understand," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I know I messed up, terribly, but I want to make it right. For Leo, for you." He squeezed her hand, a silent promise echoing in the gesture. Leo, sensing the tension, reached out and patted Sarah's hand. His small gesture, filled with innocent empathy, broke through the fragile wall of mistrust. Sarah's eyes softened, a faint smile touching her lips. The scent of roasting chicken, the warmth of the fire in the hearth, the comforting presence of his grandson. These small details created a haven, a sanctuary from the storm of their past. The fight for their family was far from over, but in that moment, amidst the flickering candlelight, a fragile hope ignited, warm and promising, like the apple pie Sarah baked nearly every Sunday. The following weeks were a tentative dance, a careful choreography of unspoken anxieties and hesitant steps toward a future none of them had envisioned. Sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of the mansion, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays, a stark contrast to the shadows of their shared past. Arthur, surprisingly, found himself drawn to the simple act of preparing Leo's breakfast, the smell of bacon and pancakes replacing the sterile scent of his usual solitary meals. He watched Leo, his small hands carefully spreading butter on a piece of toast, a stark contrast to the polished, almost clinical surfaces of his former life. One evening, amidst a board game, Leo accidentally knocked over a stack of Arthur's meticulously organized financial reports. Instead of his usual sharp rebuke, Arthur chuckled, the sound unfamiliar even to his own ears. He helped Leo gather the papers, their hands brushing, a simple act filled with a weight of unspoken understanding. "Grandpa," Leo said, his voice small but clear, "Mommy says you're different now." Arthur paused, looking at Leo's earnest gaze. He felt a lump forming in his throat. "Different how, son?" Leo shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Happier," he whispered, "And you smile more." The words hung in the air, a testament to the subtle yet profound shifts occurring within Arthur. He knelt beside Leo, pulling him into a hug, the warmth of his grandson's body a stark contrast to the icy shell he had worn for so long. That night, he found himself staring at a framed photo of a younger Sarah, her rebellious spirit shining in her eyes, a stark reminder of the life he had carelessly thrown away. Later, Sarah found Arthur in his study, staring at the photograph. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions. "She was beautiful," Arthur finally murmured, his voice a low rumble. Sarah's voice was soft, hesitant. "She still is. She's strong too. More than you ever knew." Her eyes were filled with a complex mix of pain, forgiveness, and a tentative glimmer of hope. The shared silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of an old grandfather clock. Arthur turned, his gaze locking with hers. The years of distance melted away in that shared look, replaced by a fragile, nascent understanding. The air crackled with the unspoken promise of a future yet to be written. A future built not on calculated PR moves, but on the fragile foundation of a family slowly, tentatively, finding its way home. The sprawling kitchen, usually echoing with the sterile hum of appliances, now hummed with a different kind of energy. The scent of cinnamon and apples filled the air, a stark contrast to the usual austerity. Arthur, surprisingly adept with a whisk, stirred a batch of apple crumble. Leo perched on a stool, his small hands kneading dough for biscuits. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. "Grandpa," Leo said, his voice soft, barely a whisper above the gentle clatter of spoons. "This smells nice." Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. It felt strange, unfamiliar, yet profoundly comforting. "It's apple crumble," he replied, his voice softer than he'd ever allow in a boardroom. "Your grandmother used to make it." The words hung in the air, unspoken implications clinging to them like the scent of cinnamon. Leo's small face was a mask of quiet curiosity. He looked up at Arthur, his dark eyes, so similar to Sarah's, full of a quiet trust that surprised Arthur. Later that evening, Sarah found them curled up on the sofa, a half-finished game of checkers abandoned on the coffee table. Leo was asleep, his head resting on Arthur's shoulder. The sight stirred something deep within Sarah, a pang of guilt for her past anger, a burgeoning hope for a future she'd never dared to imagine. "He's happy," Sarah said, her voice barely above a breath, the words laden with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Arthur looked at her, his gaze tender, filled with a quiet understanding that transcended their troubled past. "He deserves to be," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "And so do you." He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch gentle, reassuring. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the years of estrangement, the hurt, the unspoken words. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a delicate balance of forgiveness and fear. Their journey was far from over. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges. But for the first time, a fragile hope bloomed, a tender seedling of family, watered by the shared love of a little boy who was unknowingly the bridge between them. The following weeks were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of emotions swirling around Arthur. He found himself drawn to the simplest things. The soft thud of Leo's tiny sneakers on the polished floors, the scent of his shampoo lingering in the air, the way Leo's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. These small moments, previously insignificant, now resonated with a profound significance. He found himself purchasing children's books, a far cry from the financial reports and spreadsheets that once dominated his life. The library became a regular haunt, each chosen book a small step towards bridging the chasm created by years of emotional neglect. One Saturday morning, the crisp autumn air beckoned them outside. Arthur, bundled in a thick coat, watched Leo chase squirrels across the meticulously manicured lawns. He chuckled, the sound unfamiliar yet genuine. The sight filled him with a strange, unfamiliar warmth, a feeling he'd once dismissed as weakness, now recognizing as something precious and powerful. Later, sitting by the crackling fireplace, a mug of hot cocoa warming his hands, Arthur found himself talking to Leo. He recounted stories of his own childhood, stories he'd never shared with anyone. Leo listened intently, his small hand gripping Arthur's. For the first time, Arthur saw the fear in Leo's eyes soften, replaced with a tentative curiosity, a burgeoning trust. "Grandpa?" Leo whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Did you miss me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken longing. Arthur's throat tightened. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Leo's soft hair. "More than words can say, son," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding and a shared warmth that transcended the words. The fire crackled, a comforting counterpoint to the tempest of emotions raging within Arthur's heart. This wasn't just about PR anymore. It was about redemption, about building something real, something lasting. The crisp morning air bit at Arthur's cheeks as he watched Leo build a snowman, his small hands expertly packing the snow. Sunlight glinted off the freshly fallen snow, transforming the manicured lawns into a winter wonderland. Arthur, bundled in a thick coat, felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the winter sun. He'd spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, but Leo was slowly, patiently, chipping away at them. He hadn't intended to become a grandfather. The adoption had been a calculated move, a PR maneuver to salvage his reputation. Yet, here he was, a man who'd equated success with ruthless ambition, now finding solace in the simple act of watching his grandson create a lopsided snowman. "Grandpa," Leo called, his breath puffing out in white clouds. "Look!" The snowman, adorned with twig arms and a carrot nose, stood proudly in the snow. A small, lopsided smile played on Leo's lips. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He knelt beside Leo, the cold seeping into his knees, but the warmth in his heart far outweighed the chill. "It's magnificent," Arthur managed, his voice a little husky. He reached out, his hand covering Leo's small, gloved one. The contact was electric, a connection forged not through blood alone, but through shared moments, unspoken understanding. Later, inside the warm embrace of the mansion, Sarah entered the drawing room. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Her eyes, usually guarded, held a flicker of something akin to peace. The tension that had perpetually clung to her had eased slightly, replaced by a tentative hope. "He's happy," Sarah said softly, her gaze lingering on Leo, who was engrossed in a coloring book. "Truly happy." Arthur nodded, his gaze mirroring hers. The unspoken question hung between them. Could this last? Could this fragile peace withstand the storms that had ravaged their lives? The answer, Arthur knew, wouldn't come easily. It would require continued effort, a lifetime of commitment, a shared journey of forgiveness and healing. But looking at Leo, his grandson, his heart swelling with a love he'd never known existed, Arthur knew it was a journey he was willing to embark on. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, the uncertainty didn't feel terrifying. Felt hopeful. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the conservatory, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. Leo, perched on a velvet cushion, meticulously assembled a miniature castle from building blocks. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his small tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth. Arthur watched him, a quiet observer, the warmth of the sun a stark contrast to the chill that still lingered in his heart. He'd spent weeks trying to bridge the chasm between himself and Sarah, but the ghosts of their past continued to whisper doubts. "He's different now," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence. She stood by the French doors, her gaze lingering on Leo. The tension in her shoulders, ever present since their reunion, seemed slightly less taut. Arthur nodded, his throat tight. "He's happier." The words felt inadequate, failing to capture the profound shift he'd witnessed in Leo. The withdrawn, apprehensive child had blossomed, his laughter echoing through the once silent halls of the mansion. "It's unsettling," Sarah admitted, turning to face him, her eyes reflecting the shifting light. To see him so carefree, like nothing ever happened. A shadow crossed her face, a fleeting glimpse of the pain that still haunted her. Arthur moved closer, the scent of lilies from the nearby vases filling the air. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers. The touch was tentative, cautious, acknowledging the fragility of their newfound connection. "It's a good kind of unsettling," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It means we're doing something right." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I know your fear is real, Sarah. I know you worry about history repeating itself." Sarah's gaze met his, a mixture of apprehension and gratitude in her eyes. "It's not just history," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's trust. Can I ever truly trust you again?" The question hung heavy between them, a stark reminder of the deep wounds that needed healing. The conservatory, usually a sanctuary of quiet elegance, felt charged with unspoken anxieties, the weight of their past threatening to shatter the fragile peace they'd built. Arthur knew rebuilding that trust wouldn't be easy. It would require unwavering commitment, a relentless pursuit of honesty and transparency. And for the first time, he felt truly ready to embrace that challenge. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, a silent witness to their unspoken promises. The sprawling Blackwood estate, usually a monument to sterile elegance, felt strangely alive. Laughter, light and surprisingly unrestrained, spilled from the newly renovated playroom. Arthur, perched on a miniature rocking horse, felt a jolt of unexpected joy as he watched Leo, his grandson, a whirlwind of energy, building a magnificent tower of blocks. The scent of freshly baked cookies, a decidedly un-Blackwood aroma, hung in the air. This wasn't the cold, calculated environment he'd created. This was home. He felt a shift within himself, a thawing of the icy exterior he'd cultivated for decades. The lines etched around his eyes seemed less harsh, softened by something akin to contentment. Sarah, observing them from the doorway, smiled, a hesitant, almost fragile smile that mirrored the tentative trust blooming between them. "He's exhausting," Sarah said, her voice laced with amusement, yet tinged with a lingering apprehension. Arthur chuckled, the sound surprisingly genuine. "Exhausting and exhilarating. I never knew." He trailed off, unable to articulate the profound change Leo had wrought in his life. The emptiness that had haunted him for years, the gnawing loneliness, seemed to recede with every shared smile, every moment of playful chaos. "It's different," Sarah murmured, her gaze fixed on Leo, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of a chipped teacup. Seeing him happy, so carefree, she turned to Arthur, her eyes searching his. "It's a lot to process." Arthur rose, crossing the room to stand beside her. He placed a hand on her arm, a gentle gesture, devoid of the usual coldness. The touch, tentative at first, deepened, conveying a quiet strength, a promise of steadfast support. "I know it is," he said, his voice low and steady. "But we're doing this together. We will build something real." The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the scene in warm hues. The air, thick with the scent of cookies and the unspoken emotions that lingered between them, felt charged with a fragile hope. The path ahead would undoubtedly present further challenges. But in the shared laughter of a child and the tentative trust blooming between a father and daughter, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace. The past remained, a shadow still lurking at the edges of their lives. But for the first time, he felt it wasn't insurmountable. He had a family now, a real, imperfect, vibrant family, and that was a victory worth more than all his business successes combined. The aroma of wood smoke and damp earth clung to Sarah as she walked through the sprawling Blackwood gardens, a stark contrast to the polished sterility of the mansion. Leo, chasing a butterfly with the reckless abandon only a child possesses, lagged behind, his laughter echoing in the twilight. Sarah watched him, a bittersweet ache in her chest. This idyllic scene felt both fragile and profoundly precious. She paused, her fingers brushing against a rough-hewn stone statue, its surface cool against her skin. Arthur's presence felt like a ghost, lingering in the shadows of the ancient oaks. The weight of his past actions, the years of silence and hurt, settled heavily upon her. Could she truly trust him? Could she forgive him? "He's tired." Arthur's voice, low and unexpectedly gentle, startled her. He stood behind her, his silhouette a dark form against the fading light. Sarah turned, her eyes meeting his. "He's happy," she whispered, the words barely audible above the chirping of crickets. Too happy. The unspoken fear hung heavy between them. Was this happiness fleeting? A fragile bubble easily burst? Could Arthur, the man who'd built his empire on calculated moves, truly sustain this newfound tenderness? "I know," Arthur said, his voice husky. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers before gently resting on her arm. The touch, devoid of its usual chilling formality, carried a quiet promise. "I won't let it be." His eyes, usually guarded and distant, held a depth of emotion that startled her. They were the eyes of a man grappling with his past, yearning for redemption. The vulnerability in his gaze was both terrifying and strangely compelling. A silence fell between them, broken only by the rustling leaves and the distant sound of Leo's laughter. The weight of their shared history, the years of estrangement, seemed to hang in the air, thick and palpable. Yet, within that silence, a flicker of hope ignited a fragile ember in the darkness, promising the potential for a future built on forgiveness and love. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows on the walls of the den, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that still lingered in Sarah's heart. Leo, curled up on a plush rug at Arthur's feet, slept soundly, his small hand clutching a worn teddy bear. The air hummed with a quiet contentment, a fragile piece that felt almost too precious to touch. Arthur watched them both, his gaze lingering on Leo's peaceful face. A ghost of a smile played on his lips, a rare sight that sent a shiver of unexpected warmth through Sarah. He hadn't smiled like that in years, not genuinely. "He's so much like you," Sarah murmured, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the comfortable silence. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Arthur nodded, his eyes tracing the line of Leo's jaw, the shape of his hand. The resemblance was uncanny, a painful reminder of the life he'd missed, the daughter he'd pushed away. "I see it now," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The stubborn chin, the way he furrows his brow when he's concentrating. A tear traced a path down Sarah's cheek, unnoticed by Arthur, who was lost in his own contemplation. The past still loomed, a dark cloud threatening to extinguish the fragile flame of their nascent family. The memory of his cold, calculated actions, the years of silence, threatened to overwhelm him. But for the first time in a long time, the regret was overshadowed by a fierce protective love. He wouldn't let that cloud win. Not again. I want to make it up to you both," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. The words, simple yet profound, carried the weight of years of unspoken remorse. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch gentle, reassuring. No longer a cold, formal gesture, but an act of genuine connection, a silent promise of a better future. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and hope. The fear was still there, a constant undercurrent, but the warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his voice, were chipping away at the wall she'd built around her heart. The journey would be long, the scars deep, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of trust, a fragile beginning to healing. The fire crackled, casting their intertwined hands in a warm, flickering light, a silent promise of the future they were building, brick by fragile brick. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the scent of wood smoke from the fireplace, a comforting contrast to the lingering tension in the air. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of the renovated kitchen, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Sarah, perched on a stool at the island, carefully stirred a bowl of batter, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. Leo, perched on a high chair, babbled happily, smearing chocolate frosting on his cheek. The scene was idyllic, almost unreal, considering the turmoil of the past few months. Arthur watched them, a silent observer. The scene was a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his mansion. This kitchen, with its worn wooden table and mismatched chairs, felt more like home than any place he'd ever known. He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the comfortable silence. The cake looks delicious, he offered, the words clumsy, awkward. Sarah's shoulders tensed slightly. It's just a simple chocolate cake, she replied, her voice carefully neutral. The words belied the tremor in her hands. Trust didn't come easily, not after years of hurt and betrayal. Leo, oblivious to the unspoken tension, giggled, extending a sticky finger towards Arthur. Arthur hesitated for a moment, then gently took the small hand, wiping the frosting from Leo's cheek with his thumb. The simple act felt monumental, a silent promise of a future free from the calculated actions of his past. The warmth of Leo's small hand against his sent a wave of unexpected emotion through him. He's quite the artist, Arthur managed, a genuine smile finally breaking through the carefully constructed walls he'd erected around his heart. He felt a surge of something he'd almost forgotten, pure, unadulterated joy. The joy of witnessing the simple, innocent happiness of his grandson. Sarah softened, a faint smile touching her lips. He's certainly enthusiastic. Her gaze met his, a flicker of something akin to understanding passing between them. The air, once thick with unspoken resentments, felt lighter, the weight of the past slightly diminished by the present moment's fragile peace. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges and obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real, something lasting, family. The following weeks were a delicate dance. Arthur, despite his newfound affection for Leo, stumbled repeatedly. He'd offer Leo a toy helicopter, then snatch it back, muttering about spoiling. Sarah, witnessing this, would silently retreat, her eyes mirroring the hurt he'd caused her for years. The scent of wood smoke from Arthur's newly installed fireplace, a concession to Sarah's preference for cozy warmth over sterile efficiency, did little to alleviate the tension. One evening, after a particularly awkward dinner punctuated by strained silences, Arthur found Leo asleep on the living room rug, a worn teddy bear clutched in his small hands. The child's soft breaths, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, stirred something profound within Arthur. He knelt beside him, the plush fabric of the bear surprisingly soft beneath his fingers. The sterile perfection of his former life felt a million miles away. He reached out and gently stroked Leo's hair, a simple act that felt momentous, charged with unspoken apologies and a nascent hope. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the fine lines etched around his eyes, lines born of years spent denying his own emotions. The next morning, Arthur found Sarah in the garden, tending to the roses. The sunlight caught the diamonds on her ring, a reminder of her lost dreams. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding a hesitant rhythm. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough, I know I haven't been easy." Sarah didn't turn. "Easy?" she repeated, her voice low and laced with bitterness. "Easy is a word you wouldn't understand." The fragrance of roses filled the air, a poignant backdrop to their confrontation. "I understand now," Arthur insisted, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand the hurt I caused, and I want to make it right." He paused, searching for the right words. "I want to be a grandfather, a real one, not just a figurehead." Sarah finally turned, her eyes, the color of warm honey, filled with a mix of suspicion and a flicker of hesitant hope. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken fears and lingering resentments. The weight of the past hung heavy between them, yet, in the shared warmth of the morning sun, a fragile seed of trust had been planted. The air crackled with anticipation, with the potential for a new beginning. The mahogany boardroom, usually a stage for Arthur's ruthless business dealings, felt strangely intimate. The scent of old leather and polished wood was overpowered by the nervous tremor in his hands as he addressed his rival, Marcus Thorne. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the storm brewing between them. "Marcus," Arthur began, his voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil within. "I have something to say." He paused, meeting Thorne's sneering gaze directly. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Thorne leaned back, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Oh, and what's that? Blackwood? Another one of your carefully orchestrated PR stunts." Arthur took a deep breath, the air catching in his throat. He pushed away the ghost of doubt that whispered insidious lies, reminding him of his past mistakes. "No, Marcus, this is different." He pushed a file across the polished table, the leather creaking under the weight of his confession. The document contained the full story of Leo's adoption, the medical findings, the DNA results, the reunion with Sarah. Every carefully concealed truth laid bare. "This isn't a stunt. It's my family." Thorne's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. He picked up the file, his eyes scanning the pages. The smugness drained from his face, leaving behind a raw expression of disbelief. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway, each chime a hammer blow to Thorne's carefully constructed narrative. Arthur watched, his heart pounding a rhythm that echoed the clock's steady beat. The weight of his confession, the years of deception, the risk of everything he'd built crumbling around him, or it all hung in the balance. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about owning his past and embracing his future. He allowed himself a small, tentative smile, a fragile thing born of truth and acceptance. The game was over. The battle for public opinion was now secondary to the battle he'd won within himself. The following weeks were a blur of tentative smiles and awkward silences. Sarah, initially wary, found herself drawn to Arthur's surprisingly gentle touch when he helped Leo with his homework, the warmth of his hand surprisingly comforting against Leo's small back. The sunlit kitchen, usually a sterile expanse of gleaming chrome and marble, now held the comforting aroma of baking bread and the joyful chaos of a family in the making. One evening, as Leo recounted a funny anecdote about school, a genuine laugh escaped Arthur. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound that felt foreign yet profoundly satisfying. Sarah watched, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He's just like you, Arthur," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion. That mischievous glint in his eye. Arthur swallowed, his throat tight with unshed tears. I never knew I could feel like this," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. The confession hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of suppressed emotion. He looked at Leo, the boy now engrossed in a game with his new grandfather, his laughter echoing in the space. The boy's joy was a balm to Arthur's long-dormant soul. Later that night, in the quiet of his study, surrounded by the familiar weight of his business empire, Arthur felt a shift. The cold, polished mahogany desk felt less like a throne and more like a burden he was ready to shed. He picked up a framed photo of Sarah as a young woman, her rebellious spirit captured in a defiant smile. Regret washed over him, a tidal wave of what-ifs and could-have-beens. He pulled out his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the warmth of the photograph. He scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a number he hadn't dialed in years. His finger hovered over the call button, his heart pounding a rhythm of fear and anticipation. This wasn't just about amends. It was about building something new, something real. He pressed the button, the dial tone a tense counterpoint to the silence in his heart. A silence that he hoped, with a growing certainty, would soon be filled with the sound of family. The following weeks were a delicate dance of hesitant steps and tentative bridges. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the usual sterile gleam. The scent of Sarah's baking cinnamon, apples, and a hint of something subtly spicy replaced the antiseptic clean of Arthur's usual meals. Leo, perched on a stool, recounted a schoolyard escapade, his laughter bubbling like a spring. Arthur, watching him, felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a feeling both unfamiliar and utterly captivating. "He's got your stubborn streak," Sarah said softly, her gaze lingering on Leo. A faint smile played on her lips, a fragile flower pushing through hardened earth. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly rough. "And your spirit," he managed, the words catching in his throat. The admission hung between them, fragile and precious. He saw a flicker of something akin to forgiveness in her eyes, a glimmer of hope in the shadow of past hurt. Later, in the hushed solitude of his study, Arthur examined a photograph of Sarah from her youth, her defiant smile echoing in his memory. Regret, thick and suffocating, filled the space. He'd built his empire on cold calculation, yet here he was, humbled by the unexpected love blooming in his life. He dialed a number, his finger trembling slightly, the ringtone a stark contrast to the pounding in his chest. He had to make amends, not only for his past mistakes but for the future he wanted to build. His voice, when he spoke, was tentative, a mixture of apology and hope. The conversation that followed was a slow, painstaking process of rebuilding trust, a testament to their shared history, and a fragile step towards a future they hadn't imagined. He listened, truly listened, to Sarah's recounting of years of hardship, of quiet desperation, of enduring his silence. The weight of his actions settled heavily on his shoulders. His carefully constructed world of wealth and power felt insignificant compared to the vulnerability and forgiveness shining in his daughter's eyes. The phone call ended with a promise, a fragile hope blossoming in the fertile ground of shared forgiveness. The new family, still tentative, felt stronger, their bond cemented in a newfound vulnerability and acceptance. He looked at a family portrait, a somewhat awkwardly posed, but undeniably genuine photo, framed and placed on his desk, replacing the usual corporate awards. It was a stark contrast, but a reflection of the shifting priorities in Arthur Blackwood's life. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a stark departure from Arthur's usual black instant, hung in the air. Sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of his redesigned study, illuminating not trophies and awards, but a framed photo of a slightly awkward, but undeniably happy family. Leo, perched on Arthur's knee, traced the lines of his grandfather's face with a small, curious finger. "Grandpa," Leo said, his voice soft, "why did you adopt me?" Arthur hesitated, the question a raw nerve. He'd rehearsed the answer countless times, but the words felt inadequate. He looked at Sarah, who sat across from him, a sketchbook resting on her lap, her gaze fixed on Leo. I made a terrible mistake, Leo," Arthur said, his voice husky. "I was blinded by my own failings." He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading for understanding. She offered a small, hesitant nod. "But it was also a good mistake," Sarah interjected, a warmth coloring her voice. "It brought us together." Leo tilted his head, his large brown eyes reflecting the sunlight. "Together." Arthur reached for Leo's hand, a gesture both hesitant and profoundly heartfelt. The warmth of Leo's small hand in his own was a revelation. The cold calculations of his past felt miles away. Yes, Leo, together. A family. That night, a quiet tension filled the air. Sarah looked apprehensive, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her hair. The unspoken fear hung heavy between them, the fear of repeating the mistakes of the past. Arthur watched her, a mixture of guilt and determination in his eyes. He knew trust wasn't built overnight, but he would earn it, every single day. The following morning, Arthur's phone rang. It was his business rival, Mark Davison, his voice dripping with false concern. "Heard about your little family reunion, Blackwood. Quite the heartwarming story. Though, I must say, the timing seems convenient, doesn't it?" Davison's words were a calculated barb, aimed at undermining Arthur's recent positive press. Arthur felt a surge of anger, but he controlled it, drawing on the newfound strength he'd discovered. "Convenient for whom, Davison?" Arthur responded, his voice calm but firm, his confidence a stark contrast to his past reactions. "For the truth to emerge? Or for your smear campaign to fail?" The ensuing conversation was a battle of wills, a clash between old, ruthless tactics and newfound honesty. Arthur, fortified by his family, refused to be intimidated. He knew what he needed to do, not just for himself but for Sarah and Leo. The weight of the situation settled on him, but it was a weight he now felt capable of bearing. The fight was on, but this time, the stakes felt different, less about money and power and more about love, family, and the future. The news outlets, initially skeptical, now buzzed with a narrative far more compelling than any carefully crafted PR campaign. Arthur Blackwood, the cold, calculating tycoon, had confessed everything. The adoption, the secret investigation, the rediscovered daughter, the grandson, the raw, emotional truth resonated deeply. The articles weren't just about a PR miracle. They were about redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of family. The public, initially divided, now overwhelmingly supported Arthur. The outpouring of positive feedback was astonishing. A wave of goodwill washing over the Blackwood empire. Felt surreal. Sarah, watching the news with Leo nestled beside her, felt a mixture of relief and wonder. The years of hurt, the simmering resentment, were slowly giving way to a tentative hope. Leo, oblivious to the complexities of adult emotions, simply beamed at the television screen, pointing at his grandfather's image. "Grandpa Arthur!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with childlike adoration. Later, in the warm glow of their redesigned kitchen, Arthur sat with them, the scent of Sarah's freshly baked bread filling the air. The sterile perfection of his former mansion had been replaced by a comfortable, lived-in chaos. Toys lay scattered across the floor, a testament to the vibrancy of their new life. "It's different," Sarah admitted, her gaze lingering on Leo, who was meticulously building a tower of blocks. A shy smile played on her lips. Arthur nodded, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. "Yes, different. Better." He reached out to gently touch Sarah's hand, a silent gesture of understanding. The touch, once guarded and impersonal, now conveyed a depth of affection he hadn't known he was capable of. The fear remained, a shadow lurking at the edges of their newfound happiness, but it was overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of family, a fragile but precious bond. The past was still there, a presence they could not erase, but it no longer defined them. They were forging a new narrative, a future built on truth, love, and forgiveness. The air, once heavy with suspicion and unspoken resentments, now hummed with a quiet, yet powerful joy. The journey was far from over, but they were walking it, together. The following weeks were a blur of interviews, public appearances, and a tidal wave of public support. Arthur, surprisingly, thrived under the scrutiny. He felt strangely liberated, the weight of his carefully constructed facade lifting. The scent of jasmine from Sarah's newly planted garden replaced the sterile antiseptic smell of his mansion. He found himself drawn to the chaotic symphony of Leo's laughter echoing through the renovated house, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude he'd once embraced. One evening, nestled in the comfy, mismatched armchairs beside the crackling fireplace, Sarah spoke, her voice hesitant. "It's still hard to believe," she confessed, running a hand through Leo's soft curls. "All those years, the anger, the hurt." Arthur reached for her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "I know," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "and I understand if you can't just forget it all. But I'm committed to making this right, to being a grandfather, a father." His voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Leo, oblivious to the undercurrent of emotion, tugged on Arthur's sleeve. "Grandpa Arthur, tell me about your spaceship again." A smile, warm and genuine, spread across Arthur's face. He launched into a fantastical tale of intergalactic adventures, his voice full of the playful energy he'd never allowed himself to express before. The tension between Arthur and Sarah eased, replaced by the shared joy of their grandson's infectious enthusiasm. The laughter, genuine and unrestrained, filled the room, a soothing balm on their wounded past. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the sweetness of Sarah's baking, creating a comforting atmosphere. This wasn't just a PR miracle. It was a family reborn, fragile yet resilient. The journey was long, and shadows of doubt lingered, but the warmth of their newfound love promised a brighter tomorrow. The initial wave of public adoration subsided, replaced by a quiet acceptance, a subtle shift in perception. Arthur, once a symbol of cold corporate ambition, was now seen as a man redeemed. The warmth of the morning sun streamed through the expansive windows of his newly renovated home, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a far cry from the sterile perfection he'd once craved. He sat at the kitchen table, the scent of Sarah's coffee, strong and rich, filling the air, a stark contrast to the bland corporate fare he'd consumed for years. Leo, perched on a stool, meticulously arranged miniature cars on the table, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Grandpa Arthur," Leo announced, his voice barely a whisper. "This one needs a new tire." Arthur watched, a smile playing on his lips. He reached for a tiny tool from the box Leo had produced, his movements clumsy but deliberate. The simple act felt profound, a connection forged not in boardrooms but in shared moments of quiet joy. Sarah entered, her eyes filled with a cautious optimism. "The lawyer called," she said, her voice soft. "Everything is finalized. The trust fund. It's secure." Arthur nodded, his gaze lingering on Leo. The weight of his past actions, the years of emotional neglect, still pressed upon him. But the presence of his grandson, the quiet strength of Sarah, were slowly erasing the shadows. "There's something I need to tell you both," Arthur began, his voice hesitant. The ease of their newfound harmony felt fragile, and he was acutely aware of the potential for it to shatter. He'd been so focused on external validation, the public perception, that he'd neglected to fully address the internal wounds. The adoption, it wasn't just about the PR. I wanted a family." He paused, searching for the words, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Sarah, searching her eyes, hoping for understanding. This wasn't just a public confession. It was a vulnerable unveiling of his innermost self. The press conference, broadcast globally, felt surreal. Arthur, bathed in the warm glow of studio lights, felt a tremor of fear, a ghost of his old anxieties. Yet, a new calm settled over him, replacing the familiar icy grip of self-preservation. He'd confessed everything, the calculated adoption, his estranged daughter, the miraculous revelation. The initial silence, thick with anticipation, was broken by a ripple of applause, then a wave of cheers. The cameras flashed, capturing the tear-streaked face of Sarah, the shy smile of Leo, and the genuine remorse etched onto his own. This wasn't just a PR victory. It was a testament to the power of truth and the enduring strength of family. The scent of lilies, intended to mask the nervous sweat of the room, was almost overwhelming. Backstage, Sarah clutched Leo's hand, her knuckles white. They actually believe us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Leo squeezed her hand, his silent support a balm to her frayed nerves. Arthur joined them, his heart thrumming with a strange mix of relief and vulnerability. He reached out, tentatively touching Sarah's arm. "It's over, Sarah," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "We made it through." He looked at Leo, his grandson, and felt a swell of protectiveness so profound it nearly stole his breath. The future, once a bleak landscape of corporate battles and personal isolation, now stretched before them, lush and vibrant with possibility. A new beginning, born from a calculated risk and the unlikely miracle of rediscovery. The weeks that followed were a blur of tentative steps and hesitant smiles. Their newly formed family occupied a rented cottage by the sea, a stark contrast to Arthur's sterile mansion. The salty air, the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore, seemed to wash away the residue of years of bitterness and resentment. Leo, freed from the formality of Arthur's household, blossomed. His laughter, once a rare sound, echoed through the cottage, filling the empty spaces with joy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Arthur found himself sitting beside Leo on the beach, building a sandcastle. The sand, cool and damp between his fingers, grounded him in the present, a stark contrast to the swirling anxieties that had plagued him for so long. "Grandpa," Leo said, his voice soft. "This is nice." Arthur chuckled, a genuine sound that surprised even him. "It is, isn't it, son?" He looked at Leo, at the innocent trust reflected in his eyes, and felt a pang of guilt. How could he have been so blind, so self-absorbed, for so long? The sandcastle, a fragile monument to their newfound relationship, seemed to symbolize the precariousness of their happiness. Later, inside the cottage, Sarah watched them from the doorway, a faint smile playing on her lips. The sight of Arthur, his usually severe features softened by a gentle smile, brought a lump to her throat. He was different, she realized, truly different. The man who had once seemed impenetrable was now vulnerable, open, showing a side she never knew existed. Yet, a flicker of apprehension remained. Could this fragile peace last? Could she truly trust him to be the grandfather Leo deserved? The weight of that question settled heavily on her heart, a silent prayer for a future free from the shadows of the past. The crackling fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls, a warm counterpoint to the cool night air outside. The future, once uncertain, now felt brimming with possibilities, however fragile they might be. The cottage, nestled between the sea and the whispering pines, hummed with a quiet contentment. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah hummed a tuneless melody as she prepared breakfast, the scent of frying bacon battling the salty tang of the sea breeze. Leo, perched on a stool, sketched furiously in a worn notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. The rhythmic scratch of his pencil provided a counterpoint to Sarah's humming. Arthur, however, remained strangely silent. He sat at the table, nursing a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the swirling brown liquid. The usual sharp lines of his face were softened, almost lost. A quiet sadness clung to him, a ghost of the man he once was. "He's quiet today," Leo observed, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. Sarah glanced at Arthur, a worry creasing her forehead. "He's been like this since the interview." The interview, the public confession, the outpouring of support had been overwhelming, a tidal wave of acceptance that had washed over them. Yet, amidst the celebrations, Arthur had retreated, burdened by a weight only he seemed to feel. "Grandpa," Leo ventured, his voice soft, breaking the silence. He slid off the stool and approached Arthur, placing a hand on his arm. The gesture was small, yet profoundly significant. It held within it the fragile trust they were building, the bridge they were carefully constructing across the chasm of years of silence and separation. Arthur looked down at Leo's hand, his eyes welling up. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. I'm just thinking," he finally managed, his voice hoarse, "about everything." Sarah joined them, wrapping an arm around Leo. She looked at Arthur, her eyes full of understanding, of a quiet strength that belied the turmoil within. "It's all right to think, Dad," she said softly, "but don't let it keep you from us." He squeezed Leo's hand, the simple act conveying a depth of emotion that words couldn't express. The weight on his shoulders, though still present, felt slightly lighter. The sun, warming his face, felt like a promise of a new dawn. He had a family now, a real family, and that, he realized, was worth more than all the wealth in the world. The salt-laced wind whipped through the open windows of their seaside cottage, carrying the scent of brine and pine. Inside, a comfortable silence settled over Arthur, Sarah, and Leo. Leo, absorbed in a Lego castle, meticulously placed each tiny brick, his brow furrowed in concentration. The rhythmic click of the plastic pieces punctuated the quiet. Sarah, curled up on the sofa with a book, occasionally glanced at her father and son, a warm smile gracing her lips. Arthur, however, sat by the fire, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The warmth didn't seem to reach him. The public's acceptance had been a balm, yet a deep-seated unease lingered.